Town number 0. The small town of Folcroft, Montana, was a typical backwater with a population of about 5,000. Everyone here knew everyone by name, and life went on at a leisurely pace. That all changed one cold October evening when Joe Phillips, a local farmer, came home with a cut on his hand. It was nothing, he told his wife when she suggested he go to the hospital. The next day, however, Joe couldn't get out of bed. His skin was covered with black spots, his eyes were red, and his body was burning with fever. In the evening, he died. But that was only the first incident. 2 days later, Joe's wife, Sarah, felt sick. Doctors at the local clinic couldn't explain the symptoms. High fever, tissue necrosis, bloody cough. An ambulance took her to the nearest major hospital in Billings, but she died on the way. Meanwhile, something inexplicable began to happen in Folcroft. People were getting sick one by one. The incubation period of the disease was frighteningly short. From the first sneeze to the complete degradation of the body passed no more than a day. The local doctor, Dr. Helen Carter, tried to understand what this disease was. She noticed that each patient had the same symptoms. Internal organs seemed to be decaying, as if the body were rotting from the inside. "It's not a bacteria," she murmured, looking through the microscope. "It's a virus." Within a week, Folcroft had become an isolation zone. The government quarantined the town and surrounded it with military troops. No one was allowed to leave or enter. Dr. Carter contacted the Center for Disease Control, CDC, but their answers were evasive. Her research indicated that the virus was not natural. "It's an artificial pathogen," she told her assistant Mark. "It was created." Mark looked at her with horror. Who could have done such a thing? Someone who wanted to test it on humans. While Helen was trying to find a cure, strange things began to happen in the city. People who had died from the virus began to disappear from the morgues. Soon people began to see figures in the streets, dead people who were now moving as if someone was controlling their bodies. "It's not just a virus," Helen realized. "It's not just taking over the body, but the mind as well." The dead began to attack the remaining inhabitants. They were fast, strong, and inhumanly violent. Helen realized that time was running out. Gathering the last samples of the virus and her notes, Helen decided to flee the city to warn the world. Together with Mark, they made their way to the border of the quarantine zone. "But the military has been ordered not to let anyone out." "We can't let anyone find out," said one of the soldiers. "You don't understand," Helen shouted. "If we don't find a cure, this will spread to the whole world." The soldiers raised their weapons, but at that moment they were attacked by a mob of infected people. Helen and Mark took advantage of the chaos and broke through the perimeter. A few days later, Helen reached Billings and gave her data to the reporters. She expected the world to know the truth, but that was not the case. The media reported an outbreak of a rare disease, claiming the situation was under control, but Helen knew it was a lie. Soon, reports of strange cases began appearing all over the country. In small towns, people were getting sick and then disappearing. Helen realized that Folcroft was only the first step. The experiment continued. 2 weeks after the escape, Helen Carter and her assistant Mark began to notice that their movements were being tracked. Helen's phone was constantly heating up, and black SUVs with tinted windows kept popping up in the vicinity of their hideout. "They know we're alive," Helen said, looking out the window of the abandoned motel where they were hiding. "Who?" Mark asked, tucking in his backpack. "The ones who created the virus. We weren't supposed to get out of Folcroft." Mark remained silent. He still couldn't get the faces of the soldiers who had been left to die at the hands of the infected out of his mind. "We have samples of the virus, but they're meaningless until we know more. We need to find the source." "Are you suggesting we go back?" Mark raised his eyebrows. "No," Helen shook her head. "But I know where to look." There were references in the CDC records to a lab in Utah. "I think that's where it all started." The road to Utah proved difficult. Tensions were rising around the country. The news was silent on the virus outbreaks, but leaks began to appear on the internet. People shared videos of infected people roaming the empty streets of small towns. No one knew how to stop it. When Helen and Mark got to Utah, they found what they were looking for. An old military base half buried in the rocks. "This place looks abandoned," Mark said, examining the tall metal fence. "It's a hoax," Helen replied, noticing the security cameras hidden under rusty spotlights. Inside the base, they found something creepy. Huge containers of biological material. Some of them were labeled Sample 0, Subject F. "It's Folcroft," Helen whispered, looking at the documents. "The virus was tested on us. But the worst part was in the records. The virus, called Ashes, was designed not to destroy, but to subdue. They're using it to create an army," Mark realized. As they searched for answers, the base came to life. Alarms went off and doors slammed shut. Soon the room was filled with armed soldiers in protective suits. "Dr. Carter," said the man in the black suit, "you've gone too far." "Who are you?" Helen shouted, trying to stall for time. "We are those who protect order," the man replied dryly. "You shouldn't have left Folcroft. Your actions jeopardize our work." "Your job?" Mark exclaimed. "You're killing people." The man shrugged. "The number of victims is always secondary if the future of humanity is at stake." Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, and after a few seconds there was a loud metallic scraping sound. "What's that?" One of the soldiers turned around sharply. Figures emerged from the shadows. The distorted bodies of the infected began to attack the soldiers. The virus seemed to have escaped outside the lab. "Run!" Helen shouted. As they ran away from the base, Helen and Mark began to notice that the infected were no longer just crazy creatures. They had become organized. They moved like a pack, surrounding their prey. "They're adapting," Helen said as she watched one of the infected use a broken pipe as a weapon. "It's not just a virus anymore. It's more than that." They managed to get out of the base, but the lab was destroyed in an explosion set by the military. All evidence of the origin of the virus was gone. However, Helen realized that the virus no longer needed the lab. It was evolving on its own and finding ways to spread further. A few days later, Helen and Mark reached the nearest town, a small settlement called Riverdale. But instead of a safe haven, they found empty streets. "Looks like the Ashes have been here before," Mark said, looking at the abandoned houses. They found a small group of survivors hiding in an old supermarket. Their leader was a war veteran named Thomas. "We've seen them," he said. "They come at night. First they hide, then they take one of us. Every day there are more of them." "Are they organized?" Helen asked. "Too organized," Thomas replied. Helen realized that the virus had reached a new stage. Now it wasn't just killing, it was creating an army of creatures that could think, plan, and subjugate others. The survivors in Riverdale offered Helen and Mark to stay, but she knew the town was doomed. The virus couldn't be stopped. "We have to find a way to destroy its source," she said. "We don't even know where it is," Mark objected. "I know where it is," Thomas suddenly intervened. "The government is still conducting research at a secret base in Nevada. It's their last stronghold." Helen and Mark set off on a dangerous journey to get to the base. But the virus kept spreading. Along the way, they saw small towns die out, becoming epicenters of a new horror. When they reached the base, they found that the place was more like a fortress. Military, scientists, and government officials were working on a vaccine, but there was no success. "You're too late," said the base's chief scientist, Dr. Nolan. The virus had already begun to alter human nature itself. Helen offered to use the samples she'd brought back, but Nolan declined. "There's nothing we can do. We are only prolonging the inevitable." Helen found a way, though. She realized that the virus had a certain vulnerability to a chemical compound that could be spread through the air. This would give a chance to stop it, but the price was high. The compound had deadly side effects for humans. Helen had insisted on using the chemical compound, despite Nolan's doubts. She knew the risks were enormous, but it could stop the virus. "We don't have time to discuss it," she said. "If we don't do this, humanity will die." Dr. Nolan grudgingly agreed, and preparations began. But a few hours before the system was to be launched, Helen noticed something strange. Mark, her assistant, was talking to a group of uniformed men. She followed him and heard Mark speak. "We can't let this happen. If Helen finds out the truth, she'll destroy everything we've been working on." Her heart clenched. He was hiding something. Helen burst into the room and screamed, "What are you doing, Mark?" He turned around, his face grim. "You don't understand, Helen. This is all part of the plan. The virus isn't a mistake. It's what was supposed to happen. Did you know?" Her voice trembled. "I knew," he admitted. "I'd been working with them from the beginning." It turned out that Mark was an agent of the organization behind the creation of the virus. Their goal was far from the destruction of humanity. They wanted to create a new order where only the strongest would survive, those who could adapt. "It's all about the future," Mark continued. "You've seen it yourself. The virus is changing people, making them stronger. We're creating a new race that can survive in any environment." "You call that the future?" Helen shouted. "This isn't evolution. This is the end." But Mark was adamant. He knew Helen had a plan to spread the chemical compound, and he was going to stop her. "You won't do it," he said, pointing the gun at her. But Helen wasn't going to give up. She knew she had the only chance to destroy the virus. Using explosives, she would sabotage the lab, causing chaos. "You're making a mistake," screamed Mark as the walls began to crumble. "Maybe," Helen replied, "but I won't be part of your madness anymore." Helen managed to activate the chemical compound, but it didn't work as she expected. Instead of destroying the virus, the substance mutated it. It now spread not only through contact with the infected, but also through the air. In effect, Helen had hastened the apocalypse. By the time she realized it, it was too late. The world had begun to change faster than anyone could have imagined. The virus spiraled out of control, covering metropolitan areas and the countryside in a matter of days. Helen was left alone, pursued by both the infected and the remnants of the organization she had betrayed. The world Helen had tried to save no longer existed. Cities turned into ruins. Roads were filled with endless streams of infected people. But every day Helen noticed something strange. The virus was really changing people. Some of the infected began to show signs of consciousness. They were no longer attacking mindlessly. On the contrary, they were organizing themselves into groups, creating a semblance of a new society. "Maybe Mark was right," she whispered one day, but it was too late for regret. A few months later, Helen found herself in another small town that, to her surprise, had not been destroyed. The infected lived there in peace, using their new abilities to create a unique ecosystem. There she met the leader, a creature that called itself Leviathan. He was a human, completely mutated by the virus, but retaining his mind. "You have led us to a new beginning," Leviathan said. "The old world was doomed. Now we are building a new one, stronger than the old one." Helen realized that her efforts to stop the virus had led to something greater than she could have imagined. But was it evolution or the end of the human race? She didn't know. She only knew one thing. She was now part of this new world, whether she liked it or not. Story 2. Shadows of Project Hades. On the outskirts of West Grave, a small industrial town located far from major highways, life flowed quietly and monotonously. But that all changed when strange things began to happen in an abandoned factory. The town witnessed activity that no one talked about openly. Trucks with unknown logos drove in and out of the building, and lights burned in its windows around the clock. The townspeople whispered that there was some kind of research going on there, but no one knew what kind. One of those who noticed the oddities was Jack Haley, an ex-military man who had returned to West Grave after his discharge. He lived near the factory and often saw unknown men in black suits patrolling the grounds. One evening, on his way home, Jack smelled the odor of burning coming from the other side. Soon the smell was replaced by something chemical and nauseating, and the next morning, trouble started in town. The symptoms came on suddenly. Several workers at the plant felt a sudden weakness, headache, and burning in their throats. By mid-afternoon, these people began to complain of fever, and by evening their bodies were covered with strange purple patches. The city hospital, which could barely handle common colds, was overcrowded. Doctors didn't know how to treat the new disease, and patients were dying within 24 hours. By the evening of the first day, West Grave had become an area of chaos. Jack watched it from the window of his house. It became clear to him that the illness was no accident. The city had been sealed off. Roadblocks were set up around the perimeter, and no one was allowed through. Officials claimed they had the situation under control, but Jack saw trucks continuing to leave the factory. He couldn't sit idly by. Grabbing his old gear, he decided to figure out what was going on. At night, he snuck up to the factory. The area was lit by floodlights, and guards with guns were patrolling everywhere. Jack noticed containers loaded on trucks and lab equipment being moved out of the building. He hid behind one of the trucks and overheard the conversation. "They're out of control," one of the scientists was saying. "Project Hades was a test, but the virus has mutated. We've been ordered to destroy the traces," the guard answered him. "First the factory, then the entire city." Jack realized there wasn't much time left. By morning, West Grave had become a ghost town. The people who were still alive had locked themselves in their homes, afraid to go outside. The disease progressed at an alarming rate. Jack returned home to gather his gear and contacted Catherine, his longtime friend who worked as a journalist in a neighboring town. He sent her his notes and photos from the factory. "It's not just a disease, Cat," he said over the phone. "It's a biological weapon, and they're gonna cover it all up." "I'll call the police," she replied. "It's not enough. It has to be publicized." By evening, Jack had sneaked back onto the factory grounds. He knew he was running out of time. Inside the building, he found laboratories filled with test tubes and containers of viruses. On the walls hung documents labeled Project Hades. Category: highly dangerous weapons. In one of the rooms, he came across a group of scientists. They were working on destroying evidence. Jack made them freeze, pointing his weapon at them. "Did you create this?" he asked, barely able to contain his anger. "We were only following orders," one of them said. "It wasn't supposed to go outside the lab. And now you're going to destroy the city?" The scientist lowered his eyes. "We have no choice. If the virus spreads, the consequences will be global." Jack realized that the only way out was to stop them right now. In the main hall of the factory, he found a server box where all the data from the experiment had been downloaded. He copied them onto a flash drive, intending to give them to Catherine. But when he tried to leave the building, he was surrounded by guards. "Give me the data," one of them demanded. Jack responded with a bullet. A gunfight ensued. He managed to take cover behind metal containers, but the enemy continued to advance. He knew he couldn't hold out much longer. At that moment, another squad burst into the building. It was the military. They started shooting indiscriminately, destroying everything and everyone. Jack barely had time to get out. Behind his back, the factory exploded. A fireball rose into the sky, illuminating the dead city. Jack survived, but everything he knew was shrouded in secrecy. He gave the data on the flash drive to Catherine, but soon her phone was disconnected, and traces of the journalist disappeared. A few weeks later, it was reported on television that there had been an accident at West Grave. A chemical spill. No one said a word about the real cause, but Jack knew the truth. He left town and began working to reveal it to the world. Because Project Hades was just the beginning. Jack had gone far beyond West Grave, but every day he felt the circle around him narrowing. Catherine's phone was silent, and his own attempts to contact reporters or the authorities ended in nothing. One evening in the small motel where he was staying, the television was showing the news. The investigation into the West Grave chemical spill is complete. There is no threat to surrounding areas. The area remains under the control of the authorities. Jack exhaled heavily. That was the signal the truth had been buried once again. But he had the flash drive with the data, and now he knew it was up to him to make sure the world saw the truth. Looking for allies, Jack decided to turn to an old friend, Mark Reynolds, a former hacker who had once helped the military. Mark lived on the outskirts of Chicago and could work with any kind of system. Jack made his way to Mark's house, trying not to attract attention. The street looked quiet, but experience told him he might be followed. "Do you realize what you're getting into?" Mark asked when Jack had told him everything. "I have no other choice," Jack answered. "If we don't disclose this data, they'll continue their experiments." Mark nodded and sat down at the computer. "I can run everything through encrypted channels and send it to several major media outlets at the same time. It'll cause an uproar, but..." He fell silent. "What? If they're already looking for you, they'll definitely try to take you out after this." "Let them try," Jack replied grimly. A few hours later, the data was sent. The flash drive contained not only the results of the virus experiments, but also details about who was behind Project Hades. A corporation called Elysium Tech worked under the auspices of high-ranking officials who planned to use the virus as a weapon to wage next-generation biological warfare. An hour after the information was published, a scandal broke out in the media. Discussions began on the internet, journalists demanded comments from the authorities, and people with placards took to the streets of major cities. Jack and Mark watched the news in the apartment. "We did it," Mark said with relief. But Jack knew this was only the beginning. The hunt was on. Not an hour later, black SUVs pulled up to Mark's house. Jack saw them from the window. "They're here," he said quietly. Mark turned pale. "We don't have time. Go out the back door. I'll hold them off." "No, I'm not leaving you." "Listen." Mark grabbed his shoulder. "This world needs you more than it needs me. They want to destroy the truth, but it's out now. Just go." Jack reluctantly agreed. He grabbed his weapon and fled out the back door. Through the noise of the sirens, he heard Mark turn up the loud music and start running additional files onto the network. A few minutes later, gunshots rang out. Jack gritted his teeth but kept moving. Jack was alone now, but that didn't stop him. Using forged documents and old military connections, he made his way to Washington, D.C., where he intended to meet with a representative of an independent investigative bureau. But as it turned out, he was expected. When he entered the agreed meeting place, he saw not a journalist, but a group of armed men. "Did you think you could get away?" said the man in the black suit. "We found you back in Chicago. We just gave you some leeway to lead us to your contacts." "You won't be able to stop this," Jack replied bitterly. "People already know the truth." "You underestimate what we're capable of," the man said, and Jack felt his arms being grabbed. He was knocked out before he could do anything. When Jack came to, he was in a sterile, windowless room. The air smelled of antiseptic, and everything reminded him of that West Grave laboratory. A woman stood before him. Her stern gaze was cold and detached. "Welcome back, Mr. Haley," she said. "Who are you?" "Dr. Alice Howell, head of Project Hades." Jack laughed. "It's over. You've lost." Alice squinted her eyes. "You have no idea how deluded you are." She pressed a button on a panel, and screens appeared in front of Jack. They showed the news. Information about biological weapons published on the internet has been recognized as a fake. Journalists who disseminated this information have been detained. "We control everything, Jack," Alice said. "And those who tried to stop us are no longer a threat." Jack felt a cold fear gripping his body. Alice leaned toward him. "But don't worry, we have a new role for you. You'll be part of the next phase." "I will never work for you," she smiled. "You won't be working. You'll be the one we test the next generation of the virus on." Jack screamed as the needle slid into his arm. Somewhere far away, outside the lab, more protests began. People didn't believe the official statements and continued to search for the truth. But for Jack, the world was becoming more and more blurred. He was now part of the Hades Project. It's been months. The virus that had been injected into Jack proved to be unstable. Instead of completely overpowering his mind, it began to change his body and abilities. Jack felt his body growing stronger, but with it came side effects. Constant pain, strange visions, uncontrollable outbursts of rage. The Elysium Tech Corporation considered him their perfect test subject. They continued to experiment on him, introducing new mutations of the virus to create a biological weapon capable of adapting to any conditions. But Jack was not like the others. The virus did not destroy his will, but only made him even more determined. One day, during another experiment, there was a malfunction. Jack felt his body fill with unbearable pain, but with it came incredible strength. He ripped the straps that bound him to the operating table and attacked the guards. "The subject is out of control," came from the speakers. Jack realized this was his chance. He burst through the labs, destroying equipment and leaving chaos in his wake. Along the way, he freed other test subjects, humans who were also victims of the corporation's experiments. "We will not be silent any longer," he told them. "We will show the world what they have done to us." Jack and the other test subjects organized a rebellion inside the complex. Their bodies had been altered by the virus, but their minds remained human. They used their new abilities to break through the guards and take over the server room. "We'll get all their dirty secrets out," Jack said as he stood in front of the central computer. "They've transmitted the data outward to independent servers so that the information will spread around the world." Elysium tech secrets became public. The world learned how the corporation was experimenting on humans, creating viruses and planning to use them in wars. Protests erupted across the country and then beyond. But the corporation wasn't about to give up. They declared Jack and his associates terrorists, launching a manhunt for them. Fighting for freedom, Jack and his group became refugees. They hid, going from one city to another, but they never stopped fighting. Every day, new people joined them, those who had lost loved ones to Elysium Tech and those who wanted an end to corporate tyranny. Jack realized that he was no longer just a man. He was a symbol of resistance. Despite the constant threat, Jack didn't give up. His body continued to change, but his mind remained clear. In one of his addresses to the humans, he said, "We are not monsters. We are victims, and we will not stop until the truth prevails." The corporation could destroy cities, buy power, erase memories, but they couldn't break the spirit of the people who sought justice. Jack knew his story could end at any moment, but the fight he'd started had already gone beyond one man. It wasn't just a battle for his life. It was a war for the future of all humanity.